Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Ashley Clark. I'm the Director of Film Programming at Brooklyn Academy of Music, which, like all arts venues at the moment, is currently closed due to the ongoing pandemic. At this time, we're really thankful to resourceful distributors like Grasshopper Films, who've made the hottest August available to watch as a virtual theatrical experience. If you watched the hottest August through the BAM page on Grasshopper's website, thank you very much, as 50% of the proceeds go towards our theatre at this tough time. Please do check out the rest of what Grasshopper is offering, including Pedro Costa's incredible film, Vitalina Varela. And if you're not based in Brooklyn, which I'm sure some of you aren't, please do consider supporting your own local art house theatre by visiting the icon on the Grasshopper page. We're going to start the conversation with Brett Story, the director of The Hottest August, very soon. But I first wanted to mention that we'd love for you to contribute your own questions for this chat in the YouTube bar on the right-hand side of the screen, and we'll come to those shortly in 15-20 minutes or so. Please do take a moment, though, to read the community guidelines first. We reserve the right to delete any comment or remove any user who doesn't observe the guidelines. But at this time, I would like to say hello to Brett Story. Welcome.
Hi, Ashley. It's great to see you over the internet.
Yeah, welcome to the new reality, I guess. I mean, where to begin in this current moment, this very strange time? I think it's appropriate to ask, how are you? How are you doing? You're based in Toronto at the moment. What are you doing to keep going, to keep creative at this time?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. It seems to be the only question, really. Interestingly, I keep going by reaching out to a lot of people and asking them that. And I feel like I haven't sent so many text messages in my life as I have the past few weeks, or had as many phone calls. Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm feeling like a lot of people are feeling, which is, a strange mix of scared and anxious and bored, and grateful for to be at this moment, anyways, safe and sound in a home in Toronto, and really just kind of in a kind of shock. As I observe, mostly through the media and through conversations, what's going on right now, and how our leaders are responding, and how our neighbors are responding. And I think that's a really interesting and kind of powerful thing to witness, is some of the dissonance between how leaders, whether city leaders or national leaders, are reacting to this crisis versus how neighbors and people on the front lines are reacting to it. So I'm taking a lot of it in and trying to keep my emotional well-being as calibrated as I can, despite the challenges.
And before we get into the meat of the film, and specifically how it relates to this present moment, I'd love to hear a bit about the genesis of the project in the first place. How did this film first come about?
Sure. It's been interesting actually to think about the film through the lens of the past few weeks, because there's sort of two different pieces to how the film and the form that the film takes place in came about. And one is just a kind of, on the one hand, my own sort of meditation on what it's like to live through and get older in the age of climate crises. Thinking a lot about the difference between myself 20 years ago, who even then was considered myself ecologically aware, and the sort of intensified pitch of the sort of onslaught of news about how catastrophic things have gotten for our planet. And thinking a lot about what role art can play in a moment like this, what role sort of documentary, which is supposed to be and is saddled with the responsibility of being informative and motivating, what it could possibly do, how it could possibly intervene, and why I felt in many cases disinclined to watch climate change films or climate crisis films, despite knowing that this is something necessary to pay attention to. And then on the other hand, as a filmmaker and as a documentary filmmaker in particular, I've just really always been interested in the particular texture of encounters with strangers. You know, I'm a person who really loves city life. I moved to a city from a small town, and I've often felt like the great gift of being a filmmaker has been the way it occasions an encounter and a sort of momentary intimacy with people who are not in my immediate world necessarily. And so I liked the idea of making a film that was constituted entirely out of conversations with strangers that inhabit basically the same place, the same space, you know, something called the city. So yeah, I think that I was interested in thinking about making a climate change film that wasn't necessarily about using film as a vehicle to impart information, because I think at this point, maybe even one of the problems is that we're oversaturated with a particular kind of terrifying information, but rather took measure of the social response and asked questions like, how are we doing right now? What does the future feel like? How are we making sense of this being coexisting at this moment in history where it feels like extinction is on the horizon on a massive scale? And so those were sort of some of the thoughts and preoccupations that led me to start making this film.
And obviously with New York as one of the most catastrophically hard hit areas in this pandemic, the film feels more poignant and more eerie from today's vantage point. Could you speak a bit about deciding on New York? What about New York City, and particularly the outer boroughs that you travel to
Yeah.
that make up the film? What was so important about those particular locations for you?
Yeah, I mean, I was living in New York, and I have a sort of tremendous love for the city, and I think part of that love is the way in which it is a city through, you know, the fact of sheer volume, the fact that it's so dense and has so many people. It plays host to so many interesting and important seeming contradictions. You know, it's a place in which some of the richest people on the planet call home, and also people who are inadequately housed and are scraping by and are dealing with the worst kinds of systemic violence. And so it's a city that within its, you know, contours hosts you know, tremendous power and tremendous powerlessness, and is also a city, you know, that's not just important to the United States or to North America, but is really the seat of financial power. So I wanted to make a film that investigates climate change as a question of economy, as a question of society, as a question of race relations, not just as so-called nature, as something that's over there. So, you know, the way in which New York is sort of the epicenter of capitalism on a world scale, and as a result, I think, you know, necessarily demonstrates the consequences of a capitalist system, like housing insecurity, like huge disparities of wealth and power. And I think some of those contradictions and some of those inequities are really obviously being laid bare through today's crisis as well.
And yeah, to pick up from that, one thing that I keep bumping up against in this current crisis is the idea that the pandemic is somehow like the great leveler, which is it's a phrase that's used quite casually, when it's really exposing deep rooted inequalities that are very brutal. And I think in your work, The Hottest August, and before that, The Prison in 12 Landscapes, and the writing you do really explores that, and specifically the effects of capitalism. So you did talk about it a bit in your previous answer, but I'd love to to hear you elaborate on that in the way that you approach the film, and
Yeah.
how you decided to bring these things up with the characters that you talk to, so as not to
Yeah.
almost put them on edge.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we committed to when starting the film was to not ask people directly about climate change. Instead, we noticed as we're watching the film that my questions, there are repeated questions that I ask people, but they tend to be open. And so, I was interested in, if I ask someone, what do they worry about? How does their answer to that question reveal something about their social position? Who has the privilege, or maybe it's not a privilege, but who what situations are people in such that the thing that comes top of mind in answer to that question is something like, where am I going to get a paycheck next week? Or what am I going to do about this eviction that I'm facing next month? Versus, something that might still feel far away or existential, like climate change. I think one of the interesting things that's clear from this crisis already, in terms of who's most exposed and most dangerously exposed, who's getting the sickest and who's dying, is that we live in this skewed system that like suggests to us that value can be equated with wealth. And in fact, the people that are being deemed necessary workers are some of the most underpaid workers, and they're on the front lines of this struggle. And I think we see that. I mean, in The Hottest August, it's the film that takes place mainly in public space, because that's where it's easiest to encounter people. And the people who were spending time in social space, in public space, were people who don't have the wealth and the luxury to cordon themselves off, to go off to a second home somewhere else, or to a beach house elsewhere. So I think even sort of just socially observing how and who spends time in public space, which is something that we're obviously thinking about at this moment, where we're all being asked to socially distant, is a way of talking about class, and I think that's something that's, many people are reticent to do, but I think has been really laid bare at this moment, but always has. I mean, the climate crisis also reveals, and the economic, crisis reveals so much about class and race.
Yeah, and I think it's a trap that I'm sometimes guilty of falling into by using terms like "in this moment," where in fact it's more than a moment. It's just a reality. There's just different vectors for that reality. So we'll come to some questions in a moment from viewers. So do remember to keep putting those in. But I'll just ask one or two more. One, you've said in a previous interview that the film is a lot about the tension between aloneness and the collective.
Yeah.
And thanks to current events, that thread is even more powerfully apparent. So I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about, how that thread weaves its way through the work, even though it's ostensibly a very social film, but there's the eclipse scene where everybody's kind of alone together.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the questions that I have in all of my work, and especially in this film, is a sort of very basic question about who feels like they have power. What do you do with your fear when you don't feel like you have power? Or if you do feel like you have power, where do you feel like your power comes from? And one of the things that sort of surprised me as I was going around New York over the course of this month, asking people how they were doing and what they were thinking about, what they were worrying about, was that people did reveal a lot of anxiety, which was, I think, my expectation. I was feeling very anxious. So I thought, oh, everyone's feeling anxious. But also people would very quickly sort of turn and even after saying, I'm in this situation, it's terribly difficult, and say, but it's going to be fine because this is what's going to happen. And almost always their, optimism, if you want to call it that, was described in really individual terms. Like, okay, I'm in this housing court. This is seen with Amanda, right, in the housing court. And she's like, if you're in a housing court, it's because you're in a bad housing situation. You're facing eviction, or you're being rent gouged or something. And she's like, but tomorrow's a new day, and I'm just gonna like make some choices that are going to turn everything around and I'm going to be fine. And I feel like there's a terrible loneliness in that. I felt it was very rare to hear most people describe their sense of possibility for the world in collective terms. And I think I think we should be historical about that. That's not, natural or inevitable. I think that we've seen a real gutting over the past, 40 years of investment in the public. I mean, I think this is another thing that the COVID crisis is revealing, is that actually public infrastructure is necessary to us surviving. Guess what we need? We need hospitals. We need a social safety net. We need public health advocates. And so I think that there's a terrible, the aloneness is existential, and then it's also really material. People feel like they don't have much recourse outside of the individual, and I think that's for me anyways, that's illuminating when thinking about dealing with something on a planetary scale, whether it's a pandemic or it's the climate crises.
Thank you. So we have one audience question here. Says, thank you for your warm-hearted film. Brett, you mentioned that you love capturing intimacy with people outside your world. And how did you develop that intimacy with your film subjects off camera?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, again, I think of this as the sort of the best part of being a filmmaker, is that I'm always surprised that people are so willing to answer honestly and take the time to speak to me. I don't pre-interview people. I don't necessarily spend, months getting to know people. I'm genuinely, approaching people sometimes for the length of time that you see on the screen, like for 10 minutes, for 15 minutes, or sometimes for a few hours. And I think that in my experience making films, not just this one, but other films, I feel like people are people understand when they're being respected. People understand when a question is an honest one. And I think also people appreciate being asked what they think and how they feel about things. Again, I think people are ordinary people are devalued as experts over their own circumstances. And so if you ask a person like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? How do you make sense of that? They'll respond. And so for me, I call that intimate. I feel like I've learned something about the world through that encounter. It doesn't matter if we even know each other's last names. There's something genuine about that exchange.
Thank you. And I love the way that in the film you have a very, I suppose, polyvalent way of having an authorial presence in the film. So sometimes we can hear you occasionally off-screen prompting, but we also have the layers of text and the different narrators. And I think that helps it complicates the film, and it also gives a sense that there's more people talking to the characters or subjects in your film than just you. So I'd love to hear you talk about how you approach that.
Yeah, it was an interesting film to make in the edit room, right? We shot it over 1 month, give or take a couple days. Over that month, got about 110 hours of footage. And then I worked very closely with our editor, Nels Bangerter, over almost a year to edit it into a film. And part of the reason it takes so long is that, we treated this footage as an archive. There's no plot that's being followed. There's no, real drama per se. And so it was really up to us to make it move and feel like a film. And so I think part of that process of thinking about it as an archive was also thinking about, okay, how can this exist? Will this exist in different moments of time? How can we put things together such that we feel these exchanges in a really immediate way, and also have moments where we're asked to step back and see ourselves almost as if from a person in a future time, or another kind of species would, or an alien from another planet would. And so I think part of having my voice, just enough of my voice so that I don't, become a character in the film, but you get a sense of how the exchanges happened, and then having these texts come in and having the narrator come in was about sort of offering the possibility of multiple vantages from which to look at the footage. I mean, it's interesting. I haven't seen it in a little while. I might rewatch it soon because I feel like it's probably reads differently now during this crisis than it did even, a year ago when it played at BAMcinemaFest. And I'm sure it'll play very differently in 10 years or in 20 years, depending on what happens.
Thank you. We have another question here from Thomas. Were there any films that were influential to you when you were prepping to shoot?
Yeah, there was quite a few films and filmmakers that inspire me. I mean, the film that I talk about the most as a sort of direct inspiration is this film by the famous French essay documentarian Chris Marker, a film called Le Jolie May that he made with Pierre Lhomme, his camera person. And that was shot entirely in Paris in 1962 over the course of 1 month, the month of May. And it's also a film that's made up of these sort of conversations with strangers. And what's always impressed me about that film is that for at least the first 45 minutes, you sort of don't know what it's about. You're really just sort of like listening to people jabber on about whatever preoccupies them. And then this film slowly reveals itself as being a kind of searing indictment of the French military exercises in Algeria and the colonial violence in Algeria and the 7-year war with the Algerian resistance. And so I love films that are political, but that are also multi-textual, where they take seriously sort of everyday life, ordinary everyday life. So I think of Chantal Akerman as an influence as well, because she's a filmmaker who demands that we just pay attention to, the places and the spaces where it seems like nothing is happening, but actually everything important, including geopolitics and power dynamics, can be felt in those spaces. Even a film like Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing influenced this one. Just thinking about like, what is life about in the city? How do we feel tension? What is heat? How does racism work? Why does a neighborhood matter? So there were quite a few films that I was thinking with while making this one.
And have another question here from Jesse. Was there any material or characters that you really loved that that didn't make it into the film, that you were sad that you had to cut?
Yeah, there were a lot. I mean, I sort of, by the end of it, I loved everybody. It's really, again, I mean, I think it's sort of the weird charm of having this pretext like a camera as an excuse to converse with people and then be surprised that they will really rise to the occasion of being asked to articulate kind of ephemeral things like how we're coping. And so I think that there is I'm trying to think of specific examples. There just really were so many people. Part of what was hard about editing was that this film was shot over the course of August of 2017. So it was 8 months after the inauguration of Donald Trump. And Trump became, and I think still is, a kind of vector for all of our anxieties about how things are. And so there was a kind of impulse to always talk about Trump or blame Trump. And we really felt like that because he's sort of more symptomatic of all these kinds of crises than actually responsible per se, it became this sort of distraction. So we had to cut a lot of people out who were talking about him. I mean, one of my favorite subjects that didn't make it into the film was a man who'd come from Puerto Rico, whose father had been a liberation activist, and he moved to the Bronx, and was still like very involved in Puerto Rican politics, and lots of like older people and younger people just doing their thing. And if we could have made a film that was an hour and 10 minutes, or 110 hours long, then I don't know, maybe that film will come out one day, or maybe we'll re-scramble all the footage and make a new film out of all the stuff on the cutting room floor.
It can just be all the rushes of the duck, maybe, by the
Yeah.
basketball court.
Oh, that everybody loves that duck. I mean, I have to say, actually, that duck, he always gets laughs, but nobody loves the duck more than BAM audiences. When we screened this film at BAM, it's like they all knew the duck. It's like the duck was like, there's that duck. We love that duck. And they laughed and laughed. It was a really wonderful moment.
Well, when we reopen, perhaps we'll bring him out, he or she, I'm not sure, or they, for a Q&A. But
yeah,
we'll move on for the moment. We have another.
It'll be a bring your duck night. How about
bring your duck to the cinema. A question from Michael. Thank you for this city symphony. Discussion in documentary tends to be about content, but the film is also beautifully shot and edited with rhythm and silences. So what was behind some of your aesthetic decisions?
Thank you, and I'll pass those compliments on to our cinematographers and editor as well. Yeah, I mean, this is a film that asks us to observe our immediate world, and so observation is key. And observing what people say is as important to me as observing what's going on around us. And I think it's a film that is deliberately inviting people to make some of their own associations and conclusions. And so felt like there needed to be as much time to sort of rest in one's own thoughts as also take things in. And so, yeah, I think that there's my own aesthetic, because I make films that are sort of wide ranging and associative, is to keep images as locked off as possible, to keep things sort of clean, but also invite people to take as much delight in just sort of the strange things that are happening all around us. So it was really like we worked without B-roll, which is something you hear about in documentary a lot. This was not a film where you were going to match images to things people were saying, and instead the directive was to be in place and to look around and notice what we found interesting, whether that's an umbrella blowing away, or that's a duck at a baseball game, or it's something else. Like I think it's awfully important to just sort of think about what we see and hear and how they inform our worldview, and how we might see and hear differently if we're presented with these images and these sounds in new and hopefully at certain moments in strange ways.
And I wanted to ask about one particularly striking image from the film, which is the broken roller coaster, which seems it's such a powerful symbolic image. What was it like to happen across that when it happened?
Yeah,
how did your team react?
I don't think I've ever seen our cinematographer, Derek Howard, happier in his entire life. I mean, I'm sorry to say, but no one got injured. So I think I'm allowed to say that. We did not know that roller coaster was going to break. We were on Coney Island because it was the day, people might remember this, that they opened the Shark Tank on Coney Island. And so we thought that was a great symbolic and metaphor for the state of the world. And we thought, oh, this is great. It's going to be so perfect for the film. Let's go film this Shark Tank. And we're just walking by, and Derek happened to notice that there were people walking down the roller coaster. And we were in the trenches at this point. I mean, we were filming every day. It was very hot. We were sort of like doing somersaults in our own heads about at some point it's like, when you decide that everything means something, it can get a little crazy in your brain, because then everything is a metaphor, everything is symbolic. But certainly in that moment, he saw the roller coaster, as we all did, as kind of having this double meaning. On the one hand, like, things are breaking down. There's a crisis, things are not working. And on the other hand, there's something very tender and sort of strange about seeing like 4 people trod up very slowly up a roller coaster, take other people by the hand and lead them very slowly down. So there's a way in which it's also reflective of a kind of social solidarity that feels like it was important to be present, to have as a presence in the film as well.
Well, thank you. A couple more questions. Here's one from Laurie. Did you receive any truly unexpected answers from people that you spoke to? And did anything really surprise you?
I mean, surprise is a hard one. I think that it's not so much about being surprised. It's about giving people room for things to be as complicated as they need to be. And I think that what's useful for me is not that someone says something surprising or not. It's that if you really listen to people, someone can say something that's simultaneously true and not true, and therefore needs to be grappled with. And the moment I think of that exemplifies this is our experience on Staten Island, talking to these women who had seen their homes destroyed during Hurricane Sandy. And so I know that that scene gets read as a kind of, the strangeness of like how anyone could deny climate change, especially when they're on the front lines and have had their own homes destroyed. But we were there for quite a while, and these women, were like, yeah, our home was destroyed. There was this, flooding. Also, all of our neighbors, I have a baby here who might make an appearance. All of our neighbors have been bought out by FEMA, forced to sell their homes, told that they have to because of climate change. And now we see these developers coming in and building huge luxury apartments. And so when they say climate change is a conspiracy or that it's all Al Gore, that might seem like it's a form of climate change denial, but I actually read it as also a sort of astute observation of their own experiences, which is that they're being cheated out of their homes. Well, more powerful people get more powerful during this crisis, and authorities aren't always trustworthy. And so I feel like the experience of making the film and hopefully watching the film also includes a lot of moments where we're allowed and asked to sit in the full complexity of people's answers and experiences. Okay, I have to do it. It's my contribution to the era of Zoom photobombing, and
this kind of wraps in really nicely to my next question. Hi, Wallace. What are you kind of working on at the moment? This question comes from SK. And how has this changed since the quarantine?
Well, I am working on child rearing. So this is my daughter. She's 11 months. I was 7.5 months pregnant when the film premiered. And so this was surprising, actually. People were very excited to ask me about what I thought about being pregnant, given that I'd made a film broadly about dread and about futurelessness. Was it a sign that, in fact, I am deeply optimistic about the state of the world? But so now my daughter is 11 months, and she started daycare a week before we were all told to shelter in place. So now we're back full time, being together, and I'm gonna let her crawl away right now. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking a lot about what it means to be both creative and productive, and to contribute something right now. I mean, I think that like part of what one learns when they become a parent is how hard it is to caregive. And how it's a labor to do the work of caregiving. And I think that there's a real lesson there for this sort of question about how we're going to come to terms with the state of the planet. What kind of infrastructure do we need in order to become better stewards of the planet and stewards of each other? How are we going to care about our neighbors right now when we're told that we're not allowed to be close to them? And again, I think that's a question of thinking about ourselves as society, not as just individual units locked in our homes, having to do all the work, whether it's child rearing or taking care of elders on our own, but thinking broadly about how we do that societally. So yeah, I'm thinking of some new film projects, but mostly these days I'm thinking about ways to organize, health equipment and food aid, and do other kinds of mutual aid and political work at this moment.
Thank you so much. Don't want to keep you for too long, but we do have a question from Ian in Ottawa, which reflects what I was going to finish with anyway, which is, how can we see the rest of your work? Ian hasn't seen a film of yours since Land of Density, but wants to know where to find Prison in 12 Landscapes. Perhaps you could speak also a little bit about your book.
Sure. Yeah, so I made a film. The film that I made before this one came out in 2016. It's a film called The Prison in 12 Landscapes, and it's exploration of the US prison system through a journey across 12 vignettes that each take place outside of a prison gates. So it's really a look at how the prison is a kind of infrastructure that affects communities and systems more broadly. That film, I just actually, so you can find it on the Grasshopper site, and if you're affiliated with an institution, I encourage people to order it for their libraries, but you can also watch it online. I've just made it online for free on Vimeo. So if you go to my website for that film, prisonlandscapes.com, you can find out information there. And then I've got a couple of short films as well, one called Camper Force, which is on the Field of Vision site, and another film called A Debtor's Prison, which I think you can find just if you Google search it. But I also have a website. You can just put in my name, and it has information about all my films there.
Cool. Well, Brett, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this afternoon, and for helping to support BAM. It's so appreciated. Have a great evening, and We'll speak to you again soon.
Yeah, I hope everyone's staying safe and keeping calm and eating well. And as soon as we're able, I can't wait to go see movies at BAM again.
Thank you. All right. Thanks everybody for watching, and good evening.
Thanks. Bye.